The fact that we have 40% of young people that finish their maintained schooling in Key Stage 4 not having succeeded in getting level 2 English and maths, you can't really talk about high standards when almost half of kids are failing that. The gap is already 4.6 months between socially disadvantaged children and their more advantaged peers. By the time they finish primary schooling, that gap has grown to 9.3 months. And by the time they've finished secondary schooling, it's grown to 18.1 months. So absolutely huge. As kids get older, the harder it is to remediate that gap. So again, the emphasis needs to be on the early years, as well as, of course, broader social policies, making sure that those core concepts are in place so that young people have the foundations to build on is, again, very important. In every school or college that I visited, teachers and often young people themselves as well would talk about an overloaded curriculum.
Teacher quality and retention are often most challenging in disadvantaged communities, sadly. What does that evidence tell us about how to attract and retain teachers in those areas, which we often see spikes in high turnover and people not being able to stay in the profession? Attendance
did come through as quite an important factor as an explanation for the gap. And losing schooling, missing attendance, has a more detrimental impact for socially disadvantaged young people than it does for their more advantaged peers.
You mentioned the phrase high standards for all, not just for some. What does that actually look like in practice? Welcome to Trust Matters Lessons in Leadership. In this episode, we're joined by Professor Becky Francis CBE, CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, and one of the leading voices in education on the attainment gap and educational inequality. For much of her career, Becky has focused on one central question: why educational outcomes remain so closely tied to disadvantage and what it would actually take to change that. In this conversation, we explore why the attainment gap has proven so stubborn, what the evidence really tells us about improving outcomes for disadvantaged pupils, and why high-quality teaching remains the most powerful lever schools have. We also discuss the growing pressures schools are facing, from widening gaps in early years development to the impact of poverty on children's lives, and whether schools are increasingly being asked to solve problems far beyond the classroom. Finally, we discuss the curriculum and assessment review that Becky chaired. We talk about the key issues she believed it needed to address, what she means by high standards for all, and what now needs to happen if England is to become a more equitable education system over the next decade. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a review. Well, firstly, welcome to the podcast, Becky. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. If you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of context to your career journey so far so the listeners can understand a bit about that.
Thanks so much. Well, I've had a broadly academic career. That was the mainstay, I guess. But I made my professorship relatively early, and I've always been very interested in impact. And I noticed that somehow think tankers and those policy wonks seem to be having more policy traction outside academia than those researchers like myself in it. So from that point on, I've had a bit of a portfolio career. I've done various things, like I was standing advisor to the Education Select Committee. I've set up different policy units and so forth. I then took the job as leader director of the Institute of Education, which is the biggest faculty of education in the world, now located at UCL. And then, of course, when the opportunity came up to lead the Education Endowment Foundation, which combined all my passions, research, social justice, and so on, that was too good an opportunity to miss. So that brings you up to speed, I think.
And you spent so much of your time, as you mentioned, focusing on educational inequality. What first drew you to that, and what's kept you in that? Why has that continued to be your focus?
Well, my own experiences of schooling had quite a profound effect on me. I went to what was then a very working class comprehensive in the middle 1980s, the Thatcher years and so forth, and the height of the teacher strike. And whereas I sort of managed to just scrape through my qualifications, many of my working class friends who were just as clever as me and had always been in the same groups at school and so forth didn't do so well. And I was very aware, even at that age, of issues around social justice, what people had and didn't have. And I can even remember, it was the height of the teacher strikes when I was taking my Key Stage 4 qualifications. And I can remember there was no sort of registration of attendance or anything. So a lot of the time we just didn't go into school. And I can remember sort of hanging out with my friends on the street corner and my mum serendipitously driving past and making me get into the car to go home and do revision, much to my humiliation. But of course, my friends just stayed there smoking. And I guess, reflecting back, that kind of said it all. And I think of all of those experiences have left a strong impression on me.
And one of the things that people tend to focus on around this topic is the attainment gap. I think it's quite interesting to look at the pattern that has followed there. So it had narrowed and then stalled and then widened again after the pandemic. Why do you think in England's education system it's such a pervasive issue and one that seems to be getting worse, not better?
Well, that narrowing was really hard won. And I think, correlates with some policies that were introduced, such as the pupil premium, and a massive focus on trying to narrow the gap and the really hard work of teachers that has gone into that. But if we think more broadly, the gap is both international, every country experiences this to a greater or lesser extent. We might talk more about that. But also it's historic. Ruth Lupton's work clearly shows that, again, when I was at school, the gap was bigger than it is now. But we could argue that it was then less consequential. The labour market and so forth has changed in the meantime, and things have got much more competitive. And so attainment at school makes a bigger difference than it did historically. I guess thinking about what we can do to make an impact. When we look across hundreds of robust studies, we know that it's teacher quality that makes the biggest impact, and particularly for young people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think it's really important to stay focused on what we can do to have an effect and keep our eyes on the prize. I think the other thing to bear in mind is how that gap grew, as you said, during the pandemic when kids couldn't access schooling. And we often focus on how the gap grows as kids progress through school. But actually, we forget the mitigating effect that schooling has for socially disadvantaged kids. When they can't be at school, that gap grows even larger. So again, we should think about, the difference we are making every day as teachers and leaders, and keep focused on that.
And you mentioned internationally. Could you speak to maybe about how we do perform internationally around this sort of topic?
Yes, you can see very clear correlation between social inequality in a country and the size of the gap, which basically indicates that a lot of the explanation for the gap is outside school. Not to say that, of course, we can't, as teachers and leaders, affect it, and we can see that we can, but nevertheless, as I've said before, often if you've got growing poverty levels in your national context, you're really firefighting against that growing gap rather than being able to make more positive impact. If you look across the OECD, we have relatively large social inequality and corresponding gap, but by no means the worst. And actually, in Europe, we're sort of relatively mid-table.
Yeah. And you speak about the attainment gap being the North Star for the system at EEF. What would it look like if it was genuinely the North Star throughout all parts of the system? So from policymakers down to research think tanks through to the schools themselves, the teachers and the pupils?
Well, I think the real test of an education system is how it supports outcomes and life chances for those with the least resource. We talk a lot about high standards in our system, but still 40% of young people are coming through Key Stage 4 without gaining their level 2 maths and English. So we really do need to maintain that focus. I think it would mean every decision within education policy, but also within a school, being about thinking about an equity impact. So for every policy, budget, and so forth, thinking about how is this going to best benefit those from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. And I think that certainly in policy terms, we'd see greater focus than ever on the early years and early primary education, because trying to address the gaps that kids come into schools with and then making sure that they don't grow as they progress through the system is absolutely pivotal for basically ensuring equitable outcomes.
And one thing that the EEF has consistently championed is evidence-informed practice. What have you learned about the difference between identifying effective approaches and actually implementing them successfully in schools, which I think is always the difficulty?
This is such a key issue. I mean, I suppose the evidence that identifies good practice gives us the signposts, but it's really the implementation that is the destination, right? And Steve Higgins and Lee Elliott Major, who were the kind of key architects of the Education Endowment Foundation's famous toolkit, talk about the Bananarama principle, the song, "It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it." And actually, practices can be really strongly evidence-based, but basically if they're done poorly, they can still have either no impact or even detrimental consequence on the ground. So I suppose that one of the challenges for the EF is that we recognise that schools and teachers are incredibly busy. Capacity across the system is often very, very stretched. Often change is experienced as a threat or an extra challenge in often difficult circumstances where resources are thin. Therefore, implementation is really complex, but as I've said, also super important. I guess the good news is that we do know a lot about good practice and implementation. The EEF's implementation guidance report is by far and away our most popular guidance report. Its downloads every day is just absolutely eye-watering. And that guidance report really sets out some of the key features, including how important it is to spend time on engaging all stakeholders before you make change in a school, ensuring that understanding, that preparation and that buy-in fundamentally from teaching staff, and also thinking through the kind of implementation cycle. So from identifying and diagnosing what the problem is you're trying to address, then thinking about the evidence and how you're going to try to affect this change, planning that in, and then when you're implementing the change, also then taking the steps to monitor and fundamentally evaluate the difference that it's made and thinking about, has it made the positive impact that was expected? So all of that is hugely important.
And you mentioned earlier about high quality teaching, and the EEF states that high quality teaching is one of the biggest indicators on outcomes and has the biggest impact, especially for disadvantaged pupils. I think the phrase high quality teaching, a lot of people might think, what does that mean in practice and what does that look like when it's not happening? Do you have a bit more insight into what you guys define as that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a lot of great teaching will actually look very familiar pedagogical practice to the average classroom teacher. But these things are well evidenced now. Things like giving high quality feedback, of course, gradually removing scaffolding to make sure you're facilitating independent learning, the use of structured questioning to develop pupils' comprehension, mobilising use of vocabulary, those kind of features, all of which have a really good evidence base behind them. I guess the biggest misconceptions that exist around those teaching approaches is thinking that just doing an evidence-based approach is enough. As we've just said, even the most well-evidenced approaches, if they're done badly or thoughtlessly, can lead to detrimental impacts. Just to sort of try to bring that to life, if we think that, the evidence on good feedback means resulting in triple marking everything rather than even, quicker and more effective practice like giving verbal feedback, you've wasted a hell of a lot of time and resource needlessly. Likewise, if we think about metacognition, which again is really strongly evidenced, if teachers took that to mean promoting just general thinking skills in a vague way without tying this thinking to actual content knowledge, that might not lead to the same impacts as gradually removing scaffolding around a specific concept and so on. So again, the thinking deeply about what we're trying to achieve and then implementing it well remains really important.
And teacher quality and retention are often most challenging in disadvantaged communities, sadly. What does that evidence tell us about how to attract and retain teachers in those areas, which we often see spikes in high turnover and people not being able to stay in the profession?
Well, as I've said, it's teachers and those hundreds of interactions that they have with young people in their learning every day that has the biggest impact on outcomes. So for us and anyone who's focused on trying to close the attainment gap, recruitment and retention is absolutely key. And the biggest challenge isn't just getting teachers through the door, it's actually keeping great teachers in the schools that need them most. And exactly as you're saying, that's often the hardest thing. I guess disadvantaged schools sort of face a double penalty here, don't they? They often have the greatest need, but actually the hardest job in attracting and retaining experienced staff. Now, in terms of the evidence, we know that financial incentives do matter, particularly in recruitment. But of course, also pay alone won't solve this. And we also know the system only has so much money as well. There is, though, strong evidence that shows that targeted incentives can attract teachers into challenging areas. But then retaining teachers in those areas is as much about workload and the environment that teachers are working in as it is about pay. Professional support is really, really important. The findings are that teachers stay in schools where they can thrive, and that means manageable workload, of course, but also strong behaviour systems, really good expert supportive leadership and great professional development, as I've said, and these things matter as much as salary. And I think there's probably important to say as well that early career support is particularly critical. Schools serving in disadvantaged communities, of course, often ask the most of early career teachers, but often also without sufficient capacity to support them, and that's a real problem, I think. So I guess in England, we should be proud of the efforts that we've made in the past decade to guarantee teachers at every stage of their career access to great PD. I think the early career framework is a real step in the right direction, following the evidence around that need for early career support. And the goal should be about making disadvantaged schools or schools in areas of deprivation places where teachers are able and are supported to thrive in their careers and feel that professional agency.
And one of the other things you've mentioned during this conversation is the importance of early years in the attainment gap. I think we've heard a lot, especially post-pandemic, around the gaps that children are arriving at school with. How concerned are you about those, and what can be done to address that?
Yeah, well, it's fundamental. There are still large gaps when children join school, and one of the concerning things about language gaps is that it does seem to contribute to ongoing disparities as kids move through the school system. And there's increasing evidence on this, including some research that we've recently commissioned from EPI. The good news is that I think we are increasingly understanding effective practice around early language support, not just in specific support, individual one-to-one support, but also programmatic work, such as an example that's been based on EF RCT evidence is the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, or NELI for short, which is now one of the best evidenced programs in the world, actually. It's been through 3 EF commissioned randomized controlled trials, showing not just a really strong improvement for young people undertaking the program, but particularly benefit for kids from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. And based on that evidence, it's nationally available, which I think is a wonderful example of evidence-based policy making as well.
And at the CST's annual conference last year, you said something really powerful. You said that without tackling child poverty, all of us in the education system working in schools are just firefighting. How much can schools realistically do in this area when a lot of this around disadvantage, poverty, family circumstances are happening outside of the school gates?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think there are sort of 2 layers to this, really. One is that I do agree that there's a risk that schools become the policy solution to everything, and that's both misguided but also detrimental, very stressful for teachers, and actually risks distracting teachers from that super important, great teaching practice that's the most important difference that they can make to socially disadvantaged young people. Of course, teachers are compassionate, and most teachers actually join the profession because they want to make a difference in exactly these ways. But kind of layering on responsibilities that are beyond their control that's not conducive to recruitment and retention. And as I said, could be distracting from teachers' main professional mission as well. So I think that is problematic. Nevertheless, I think also, as I've said, we know that there is a big difference that schools can make too. So we know that much of the gap is explained by what goes on outside school in terms of, as you've said, poverty and those ongoing compounding factors in different levels of financial, but also sort of cultural and social capital resource as kids go through schools. In fact, in terms of, again, research that we've recently commissioned from EPI, you can see that as kids move through the school system, their prior attainment, and for socially disadvantaged young people, on average, their lower prior attainment has a compounding effect so that gap gets bigger over time. Again, sorry, as an aside, showing the importance of early intervention and making sure that kids have those core concepts on which to successfully build. But sorry, coming back to your point, of course, I think that there is so much that can be done by teachers in schools to remedy those gaps. And we can see that, of course, from the data and the impact that some schools, some local authorities and some multi-academy trusts are having on narrowing gaps successfully.
And throughout your career, you've worked closely with researchers, policymakers, and government. What have you learned about the relationship between policymakers, politics, research, schools, and how they work together and the impact when it works well and maybe the impact when it doesn't work so well?
Yeah, well, I think we are much more evidence-led than we used to be. I just gave the example of the Nuffield Early Language Intervention and very many other proven programs that have been rolled out by government because they're shown to be effective. I think that government and policymakers are much more interested than in the past in evaluating policy changes and so forth to try to find out whether they have had effective impact. And that's becoming sort of relatively habitual now, I think, that you have evaluations of policy changes. But there is still a very long way to go. And sometimes those evaluations can be a bit of an add-on if and when they do happen, or they shrink because there's not enough money, and so forth. I suppose it's realistic to say that policy making will never only be about research evidence. Of course, it's also about cost, feasibility, politics, what the general public think or have appetite for, and so on. And that's why, of course, many people refer to evidence-informed policy making as the best that can be expected. I'd like to be a bit more ambitious than that. I'd like to think that at least we can be evidence-led in policy making. And I'd also like to see something that we ourselves take seriously at the Education Endowment Foundation, but can always do better as well. That tighter interface between policymaking and what actually goes on in the classroom, in schools every day. Often there is a world of difference in the hallowed halls at Westminster from the average life of a school, particularly a school in, I don't know, a disadvantaged coastal town or in a rural setting and so forth. Having that interface between policy making and the realities of life in the classroom is difficult to achieve, but it strikes me, especially in my sort of year spent in the civil service while I was delivering the curriculum and assessment review, super important.
And I'm glad you've come on to the curriculum and assessment review because it wasn't a small feat and you chaired that yourself. And I think it would be helpful for the listeners. I think most would know about the review, but could you just give a couple of the key headlines of some of the things that came out of the report?
Well, I guess the review was subtitled Building a World-Class Curriculum for All. And that, to my mind, captures everything that we were trying to achieve. We were trying to capitalise on some of the successes in curriculum and assessment in England over the last 20 years. And definitely there has been progress that we wanted to build on rather than undermine. But we did want to make sure that when we talk about high standards, that does mean high standards for all young people. As I was just saying earlier, the fact that we have 40% of young people that finish their maintained schooling in Key Stage 4 not having succeeded in getting level 2 English and maths, you can't really talk about high standards when almost half of kids are failing that. So we wanted to really kick the tires to ensure that we could be supporting social inequality and supporting, as I've already said, that early success and scaffolding that ensures that every young person can succeed and thrive. We talk in very abstract terms, but this is about ensuring that young people can thrive at school, gain the knowledge and skills that they need to succeed in life, but also engender that love of learning that is going to set them up for their, education and their re-education, their engagement with education throughout the life course.
And what would you say are some of the things you learned throughout that time of doing the review about some of the big changes people felt really passionately about wanting to make in the sector?
Yes, there are so many. It's very hard to reflect back now, but there were some really driving key themes. I mean, one of the interesting things was about balancing breadth and depth in the curriculum. There was a very strong view that came through the call for evidence responses, but also, in every school or college that I visited, teachers and often young people themselves as well would talk about an overloaded curriculum. Now, when we dug into that, there are a whole range of different explanations for that, because sometimes when you'd hear about this terrible curriculum overload, you'd then go back to look at the programs of study for the national curriculum, and you'd think, actually, this looks pretty lean. And in some cases, then the lack of specification in the program of study was resulting in schools feeling that they have to cover every base just in case it comes up in an exam and so forth. So there were a whole range of different explanations there. People talked about accountability pressures and so forth, and, different expectations that I think may have been built over time, as well as, of course, genuinely content that had been built and added to the curriculum over time. And interestingly, previously, when there had been reviews of the curriculum, the number of hours in a school day and what was feasible to achieve had never really been modelled in. So that was one of the things that we stipulated had to happen in this version of the curriculum changes. We also were trying to think about the distinction between the national curriculum as a really high quality entitlement for all, but only ever expected to be part of the broader school curriculum. So when the national curriculum was introduced, it was only seen as a smaller component of the wider school curriculum. And we thought that's really important. Whereas over time, of course, the national curriculum had sort of been added to so far that certainly in terms of the experience on the ground, it was often exceeding the school day rather than being a part of it. So part of the directions within the review's final report have been to try to bring that back, to make sure that there is a focus on the critical knowledge and skills that young people need, and need equality of access to. Whether you move school or to a different part of the country, you have that entitlement that you'll be covering the same core knowledge, but that then schools have the flexibility to be not just bringing the curriculum to life for their local demographics, and teachers know their kids best and their needs best, right? But also ensuring all of those super valuable activities, the enrichment, the careers advice, work experience, and so forth that schools provide to their young people every day.
So within that, you mentioned the phrase high standards for all, not just for some. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have lots of sort of struggles in the education system in terms of realising standards, again, especially standards for all. And one of the kind of tendencies often is for people to think, well, different groups of young people need different provision or different types of education, whether that's based on their socioeconomic background, or whether it's based, for example, on whether they are identified with SEND needs or not, and so forth. And we heard this a lot in the evidence that we took for the curriculum and assessment review. Kids with SEND need a different type of curriculum, for example, or kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds should be, their progress should be taken out of Progress 8 and dealt with differently, and so forth. These kind of ideas. But we know from the prior research that whenever you start segregating different pathways. Basically, you end up with a kind of sheep and goats scenario where young people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds or young people with particular SEND conditions as well, end up being sort of channeled down particular routes, often with lower prospects, lower expectations, and often a very restricted educational offer that doesn't successfully often engender that thriving and a love of learning. So it's a really difficult balance, because it's not to say that, of course, some of these challenges aren't real, but we felt that the emphasis needed to be retaining a focus on high expectations for all, rather than thinking about opt-outs or different routes and so forth. That also maps on to the thinking that we did about post-16, because while A-levels have a really strong reputation, both nationally and internationally, vocational qualifications have historically in England had a bit of a kind of Wild West feel and reputation, with many different qualifications out there delivering good destinations for young people, but many also not clear, not delivering those good outcomes, and often really hard for young people and parents to understand as well, and employers too. So the introduction of V levels was to complement A levels and the existing T level offer, to make sure that there is a high quality vocational route for young people that either don't want or can't access 3 A levels, but do want meaningful level 3 qualifications that successfully take them either out into university or into apprenticeships and employment effectively. And that's what we hope that they'll deliver.
That's great. And just thinking around that, what do the stats look like in terms of the attainment gap from primary to secondary to post-16 if it's not caught at that early years stage? Like what's the compounded impact look like, maybe statistically?
So in terms of the way the gap develops through schooling, we know that for the youngest children, when they arrive in nursery and complete the early years foundation stage, the gap is already 4.6 months between socially disadvantaged children and their more advantaged peers. By the time they finish primary schooling, that gap has grown to 9.3 months. And by the time they've finished secondary schooling, it's grown to 18.1 months. So absolutely huge. Obviously, the longer that goes on, you can see how the gap is compounded as kids go through school due to a whole range of different explanations. But of course, it just goes to show that as kids get older, the harder it is to remediate that gap. So again, the emphasis needs to be on the early years, as well as, of course, broader social policies out. But for teachers and leaders, thinking about how we remediate those gaps at the earlier stages, whether if you're in a primary school, if it's, in the early years setting and in Key Stage 1, or if you're in secondary school, getting in year 7. Is super important and the way to think, I think. And again, as we have already talked about, making sure that those core concepts are in place so that young people have the foundations to build on is, again, very important. We recently commissioned some research by EPI focused on the kind of explanations for the gap. And as you would expect, those are multiple. Prior attainment, again, emerges and becomes compounded as an explanation as kids move through the system. And of course, that's intuitive because, as I've said, if kids are struggling with their learning, those struggles are going to be exacerbated if the basics aren't in place. But also to note, attendance did come through as quite an important factor as an explanation for the gap. And losing schooling, missing attendance, has a more detrimental impact for socially disadvantaged young people than it does for their more advantaged peers. So the good work that schools are doing to try to make sure that kids do show up is very, very worthwhile, according to the evidence.
That was actually going to be my next point around attendance. I imagine that was one of the things that came up in the research. And when you look at good practice, schools that are doing this really well as tackling attendance is a big part of this, what are some of the other things that you see them doing practically?
The evidence on what works for attendance in school is actually very weak at present. The EEF has just embarked on some studies around this, and very much showing that the school is an environment that cares and focuses on those young people is found to have a positive impact. But nevertheless, there's a lot more that we need to learn. I think the good news is that we can see many schools are succeeding in doing this well. So actually learning from best practice on the ground is an opportunity, I think, in regard to attendance too.
So looking ahead to 2035, which is the EEF's long-term horizon, we don't have a crystal ball, but what would success look like to you? What would need to be different for you and the EEF to be able to say this has been addressed and change has been made?
Well, obviously, the attainment gap and narrowing the attainment gap is the Education Endowment Foundation's North Star, as it is for so many schools, leaders, colleges and their leaders too. But of course, now, as we've been discussing, it's somewhat beyond all of our control due to the explanations that lie outside schooling. But nevertheless, clearly we can support best bets that are going to equip teachers and school leaders best to address the gap. And what I'd like to see is that teachers and school leaders feel that they have relevant evidence at their fingertips to know the most effective ways to support those disadvantaged learners most effectively. I'm very aware that at the moment we remain a long way away from that. We're beginning to, be able to drip feed in really helpful evidence that helps teachers and leaders think in particular ways, perhaps allows them to purchase in really effective programs to support kids that are falling behind, and enables them to think about effective practices in day-to-day teaching that will be either most effective or to prevent bad practices and detrimental practices as well. But we're still very much in the foothills of that journey. There are so many gaps in the evidence, and that's what we're determined to address.
And we like to finish the podcast with a quick fire round of 4 questions. So the first question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the education sector at the moment?
I think the biggest challenges are still around capacity and teacher supply. Everything that we've said about the importance of high quality teaching, that this makes the biggest difference for socially disadvantaged young people, that transformative experience with a subject expert teacher or a really lively, passionate teacher in primary school. But recruitment and retention makes that challenging. So we know that that's a critical issue. We've also talked a lot about issues around attendance and, of course, general capacity in the system as well. So all of these we're still on the journey with.
The second question, what motivates you on difficult days?
My love of education and my determination to try to make a difference in a humble but, making the effort there. I do feel passionate about education as a service, the privilege that we have of working in education, the transformative experiences that many teachers and leaders are providing for the young people that progress through their schools, and then the privilege in turn that the Education Endowment Foundation can support that practice. That is really motivating.
Third question, what's been your proudest achievement in your career so far?
Well, again, I'm lucky to say that there have been a few. I've been really honoured to be selected for various jobs that I've done. Obviously leading the Institute of Education and now leading the Education Endowment Foundation. These are huge privileges, and such a privilege to be leading such talented groups of people, and as I say, to be in these positions where you can support the education system. But I must say, delivering the curriculum and assessment review, feeling proud that I think it is a high quality piece of work based as far as we could be on evidence and data, and feeling pleased that it has landed well with the sector. That was a moment of, I think, pride and relief for myself and the other panel members for the review.
And final question, what are you most looking forward to in the next academic year?
Well, I'm really excited about some of the work that the Education Endowment Foundation is doing to support evidence on two key areas. One is the evidence on SEND, thinking about what does high quality teaching look like for young people with SEND, and every young person, of course, and being able to support the sector with more evidence in that direction. And also evidence around the impact of AI and generative AI on learning. I feel strongly that we haven't really yet international evidence on the impact of generative AI on cognition, let alone how it's playing out in the education system more broadly. And it's really urgent that we address some of those fundamental questions.
Well, that will be really interesting to see. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Becky. And just a wider thank you for everything you've done and continue to do for the sector. It's really, really important work. And I know there's so many people listening who admire what you do and what the EEF does. So thank you for coming on and speaking today.
Thanks for the opportunity.